will be making a rock star entrance any moment. Thank you all for coming on a Sunday morning to hear our panel on Frank Stanford. We're going to do just very brief introductions, and then we're going to launch into a panel discussion that I'll do my best to moderate. My name is James McWilliams, and my biography of Frank Stanford comes out in July with the University of Arkansas Press. When I started researching the biography many years ago, I expected to encounter a Frank Stanford who was a chronic self-mythologizer, who was kind of shrouded in lies and deceptions. And there were obviously these kind of glaring infidelities in his life, but I have to say I found a Frank Stanford, discovered a Frank Stanford who was like remarkably, disarmingly, radically direct and honest in the way that he lived his life. And I think this is really important for us to sort of lead with, because the life and the poetry were intimately connected. I mean, they were just intricately entwined. And so, when you find yourself moved by or, feeling a Frank Stanford poem, I'm convinced you're also feeling the intensity and the vitality of a life that was really quite fully lived, even though he ended it at the age of 29. So I want to open with that, and now I'll just turn it over for the introductions for the rest of the panel.
My name is Bill Willett. I met Frank Stanford when we were 12 years old and knew him for 18 years, through learning to play football together, living together at the University of Arkansas, and just being friends. A great friend he was.
My name is A.P. Walton, and I've been editing for some years the first ever edition of Stanford's Letters, which is also forthcoming from the University of Arkansas Press. And I've been researching Stanford for a number of years before that, actually. I wrote my graduate thesis on Stanford at Lund University in Sweden. If you're wondering what it's like to edit a volume of letters, imagine that you were to send a letter tomorrow in 2025 out into the world, and someone that you've never met in the 2070s is going to come along and try to find that letter. That's me. I've done that, and then try to amplify that to the tune of hundreds. It's not easy work. Sometimes it's easier than others, but it's been an adventure that I've been working on for a number of years. And in terms of what many people who are interested in Stanford would be wondering is, are the letters good? All I can tell you is you're in for a little bit of a treat. I think they're very special. These are rare documents that are kind of like windows into the soul of kind of a great poet. And the pressure that I've felt under is like, imagine that there's some great poet or great author that you know about and that everyone has heard of, and there's this great literary masterwork that this author or poet wrote that no one has ever read. The poet or author never read it. It just got written, and many people don't even know it exists. That's basically what I feel, the pressure that I've felt under for a long time to handle this special document in the right way, to honor the poet and to honor the people who would enjoy reading it. So I'm very excited that I think within a year people are going to be able to access this book.
Thank you. My name is Canese Jarboe. I'm a poet born and raised in the Ozarks, and growing up, I did not know that there was a literary tradition in the Ozarks. Studying poetry at Pittsburgh State University, I read poets who absolutely were not from the region, and it took moving across the country to even hear Frank Stanford's name for the first time, or C.D. Wright's name for the first time. And although I'm not necessarily a researcher of Frank Stanford, I am an avid reader and lover of his work. And as a transmasculine person and close reader, something that I've done, even handwriting. There was a phase I went through where I was writing by hand the battlefield where the moon says, "I love you," just to feel maybe something that he felt. And I tried to bring a perspective to his work that I don't hear a lot. As this kind of cult figure that he's become, I don't often hear people point out some of the aspects of gender and sexuality in his work that I find interesting, some of the homoerotic undertones, the way that he writes himself into gender, whether it's hypermasculinity or into feminine speakers in a way that his peers absolutely were not doing. Hopefully today I can illuminate some of that or ask potent questions. Aidan.
Thanks. So my name is Aidan Ryan. My relationship with Stanford's work, I think, has been primarily as a publisher of a small press called Foundlings. In 2017, it was a group of us. We all thought, we deeply loved the work of Frank Stanford and thought we would put out a little edition of our magazine dedicated to Frank Stanford. And then that project absolutely exploded into a large anthology that forced us to switch from being a magazine to being a press. And through that process, I got to meet so many other people in this rich community around Frank Stanford. I wanted to pose two questions or ideas here, just to express, I guess, what I'm primarily interested in right now, close to 10 years after that anthology came out. I've sensed always that there's something unreconciled within the community of readership and scholarship around Frank Stanford. And I would put it this way. One of the chief characteristics of his poetry is its capacity. It is an enormous poetry that contains everything. But the readership to date has been somewhat niche, you might even say. And you could grow up in the Ozarks and not know about Stanford. That simply doesn't make sense. And the poetry requires a larger and more diverse and more engaged readership so that we can understand it. So that's my primary interest. And then sort of nested within that, in her preface to The Battlefield, C.D. Wright, I think, correctly observed that this book, at least, doesn't really have a home in the Academy. The Academy can't contain at least this book. And yet, Yale and Brown and University of Arkansas, among others, have played an important role in keeping this work alive. So I think there's a new question we can ask now. What is the relationship of the Academy to the poetry of Frank Stanford?
Great, thank you all so much. Researching Stanford's life is very difficult, and we're going to delve into some of those difficulties. But anybody who thinks, like I did when I started the research, that you can just go to the Beinecke at Yale and dive into the archive there and write a biography of Frank Stanford is going to have a rude awakening because the archive is dispersed, it's fragmented, it's disjointed. I want to open up by asking Bill a question, because Bill is the only person on this panel who knew Frank Stanford personally, and it highlights a kind of realm of that archive that I think we have not fully appreciated, which is the fact that a lot of what we know about Stanford, or don't know about Stanford, is vested in the memories of the people who knew Frank Stanford. And so this is beyond the conventional archive, and we have to get into things like oral history. So, Bill, my question for you is, when you think about your role in promoting the life and legacy and poetry of Frank Stanford, how do you think about that? How do you conceive of your role in that respect?
One of the things that I will do is to recount all the experiences that I had with Frank for the 18 years, like from the time we were 13 years old until the time he was 29 years old when he passed away. And those were very important moments. It was moments when you would see Frank in his writing capacity, like at 221 Buchanan, go back into his room for 3 to 4 days in a row, wearing a t-shirt with a V-neck and a pair of gym shorts, barefooted, with bourbon and water and a restroom, and write for 3 or 4 days at a time.
Yeah.
And write about the things that he was familiar with, the things that he had experienced as a young person, and things that he had experienced through all the vast reading that he did.
To ask a follow-up question, when you look at the work, the little work that is being done on Frank Stanford, do you feel like something is missing? Like, do you feel as if, I mean, kind of touching on Aidan's question, that maybe an academic approach is the wrong approach to understanding Frank Stanford? Does that make sense to you?
Well, the academic approach has failed to this point. Like, Frank Stanford was the first person to ever be admitted in the Master of Fine Art program at the University of Arkansas without a degree, and he was the only person that was ever admitted to that. And what was that reason for that? Possibly the jealousy of the people that were associated with him, not wanting to recognize that someone that didn't have an undergraduate degree or a master's degree could write as prolific as he could. And one of the things that I appreciate with Aidan, Adam,
Yeah.
and yourself doing this work is that you're bringing, although it's very late as far as I'm concerned, you're like life back into Frank Stanford's work.
So, Adam, I actually wanted to see if you can comment on this a little bit, because Adam and I have shared the experience of tracking a lot of Stanford's contemporaries down, and this has involved at times kind of detective work, and we've had to find people and then interview people. And can you talk a little bit maybe about the challenges again, like trying to understand Stanford in the fullest way that we can? We have to talk to these people. Can you talk about some of the challenges involved?
Yeah, I will just piggyback a little bit on what was said there. I don't think that it's only been in the academy that Stanford has been understood or kept alive or appreciated. There have been a great number of magazine and newspaper articles and blog posts. There's plenty of people on the web online that haven't really bothered to get rights to reprint a poem, and they just throw something up because they love it and then they write about it. And that's beautiful as well. I think it's a multifold sphere that has existed of Frank Stanford's legacy, if you want to call it that, over the last 50 years. But it has nonetheless, I think all of us at this table would probably agree, it has nonetheless been fringe or cult or niche or whatever. Most of us would probably agree that we're trying to move beyond that. We're trying to, whatever it is that we envision the future holding, that's what we're trying to move to, is something away from the cult appreciation and the niche appreciation can exist. It's beautiful that it does, but it also, this is a poet who has never appeared in a Norton anthology. If you believe in this poet's work, you find that dumbfounding. I've found it dumbfounding for many years. So that said, James asked me a second ago, the difficulties of researching Stanford's work, of tracking people down, the importance of it. Yeah, it's very important. These are people who have recollections and memories and factoids that have to be charted down. And there's so many great stories that I can't get into, but just for time reasons. But like one of them is the great story of how we found Cheryl Campbell, who was one of the great loves of Stanford's life. I looked for Cheryl Campbell for about a decade. Never found her. I have emails that I sent to Cheryl Campbell's in the world, only for them to reply and say, "Sorry, not the right Cheryl. Good luck." And finally found her a couple years ago. And if you can imagine, she was married multiple times, widowed, now lives alone under a different name in a different state, etc. And she, of course, held on to her letters from Frank Stanford for 50 years.
It was a gold mine.
It was a gold mine, but I would also just add that Frank Stanford touched her life such that she never trashed those letters, and Frank Stanford had that same impact on most everyone who encountered him, it seems. Yeah. So
I want to follow up on one thing. So, I mean, the stories that, and I'm sure all of us can tell these stories about sort of tracking down these elements of Frank Stanford's life, requires a set of skills that, like, I don't know, I've had to acquire them over the course of my research. Like, I was not trained in any of this. And so getting at Frank Stanford requires doing a kind of research that I've, never actually, there's no genre for it. You have to kind of make it up as you go along. So I don't know. I mean, that's maybe appropriate for
Yeah,
Stanford.
I'll just
Real
say,
quick, and then I'm gonna switch gears
yeah, it's
here.
basically like a 50,000 piece jigsaw puzzle that you're trying to put together, and it feels oftentimes like you're trying to keep all these pieces in your head.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Right. So, again, thinking of sort of challenges or conceptions or even misconceptions of Frank Stanford and trying to understand the life and therefore the poetry. Canese, I want to turn to you and have you talk a little bit about, maybe try to help us understand why Stanford is perceived to be this hyper-masculine poet. I mean, you have thought more than anybody about the intersection of Frank Stanford and gender. So my hunch is that we create hurdles to understanding Frank Stanford when we over-categorize him, as this, manly man's poet. And so if I could get you to comment about that would be great.
Thank you. I thought a lot about the way that you have to develop this way of existing in that world that is hyper masculine if you're going to survive it. If you know anything like we do about Frank Stanford's childhood and growing up, I mean, you gotta be hyper masculine. It's good for you to do that, to be able to move through the world. And I think it's a place of comfort to return to the things that help us move through the world as adults. That's where we return to, like, those coping mechanisms that help us move through the world. And so the way that I tend to think about it now is that, as we see, 29 is so young. I mean, we say, yes, he lived a lot, but what would he have done, if he had lived longer than that? And so I think about just the way his poetics progressed in that short amount of time, and the way that I see his vulnerability, and almost like he's ashamed to have been too vulnerable, and swings back to that comfortable place of hypermasculinity. There's a poem that I think about often, and it's called Everybody Who Is Dead, and it encapsulates what I think about when he writes about these really tender moments between men that I think are incredibly beautiful. And I'll read it. It's very short, but when a man knows another man is looking for him, he doesn't hide. He doesn't wait to spend another night with his wife or put his children to sleep. He puts on a clean shirt and a dark suit and goes to the barber shop to let another man shave him. He shuts his eyes, remembers himself as a boy lying naked on a rock by the water. Then he asks for the special lotion. The old men line up by the chair, and the barber pours a little in each of their hands. That poem, I always come back to that poem. And I think that there are like these incredibly beautiful moments, and he never shies away from his admiration of other men. And I have really, dove into that. And there are so many moments where, I think like in Blue Yodel of Those Who Are Always Telling Me, there's a moment that kind of penetrates that myth that he tends to build around himself. That you talk like a queer sometimes, that I get the sense that he probably was told that a lot in his life because of just how he moved through the world. And these are things that I am thinking a lot about, just like hypermasculine drag in his poetry and how that might be a coping mechanism or a way to deal with the world.
I'd also just mention that in the only essay Stanford ever published, it was called "With the Approach of the Oak, the Axeman Quakes." He mentioned that, and this almost, when I first read it, sounded like pretending, but I think it actually wasn't. I think it was wholly true, at least in his mind at that time. This was in the mid 1970s, written maybe around 1975, published 2 years later. He said to that point, it had mostly been women who had been drawn to his work, and that he had for some years put some masculine elements into his work to get it so that it could be accepted more. That seems so strange to me because I have known his work to largely be, it always seemed to be more appreciated by more often than not male readers. But at that time, I can actually think of the individuals whom he was corresponding with, women editors who were responding very favorably, women like C.D. Wright as well, responding very favorably, and he had some experiences in the MFA program with largely male poets, which probably were not very encouraging to him. So I think at that point, that was what he perceived. But that's the point.
Canese, I really appreciate what you had to say about like adapting to life in the Ozarks required assuming a kind of masculine stance, and I was immediately thought of Bill, your story of, correct me if I'm wrong, but your first meeting with Frank was through a fist fight, was it not?
No, it wasn't from a fist fight. It was the 8th grade tryouts for the football team. And in Mountain Home at that time, the football team didn't have a whole lot of uniforms. So the first thing that happens, the guys in the 9th grade, they get the uniforms automatically. Then the big guys in the 8th grade, whether the coach knows about their abilities or not, gets a uniform, and then all of a sudden there's just a couple of uniforms left. So it gets down to one uniform, and the coach looks at me and he looks at Frank, and I'm thinking probably the same thing Frank's thinking. I said, "What's wrong with this coach? This was a new coach. He didn't know anything about our abilities." I said, "What's wrong with this guy? Can't he see how good we are?" So he picked Frank and I, we gave us a helmet. He says, "What you have to do, you can use your elbows, your arms, and your shoulders, but you can't use your fist, you can't grab. And the one that comes out of this tussle is the one that's going to get this last uniform." And so it's a hot day. About the first week of September, you're like probably about 100 degrees and real dirty, just dirt. And so Frank and I go at it, for what seems like a long time, probably maybe a minute and a half. Just forearm shivers, head busts, that type of stuff. The coach finally comes in and drags us apart, goes over to the guy who got the next to the last uniform, took it away from him. Gave us both again.
See what I mean about those oral histories?
I'm thinking all the time.
You don't find that in the archive at Yale.
I was really impressed by this guy's strength because I was raised with, my parents had 11 children and 8 of them were boys. So we had a chance to try out our masculinity. So I knew that this guy had what it took.
You have to say you broke even?
Yes.
Okay. Aidan, the book that your press put out, Constant Stranger, strikes me as, and I mean this in the best possible way, like an unconventional, idiosyncratic publication dedicated to Frank Stanford. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about kind of some of the thoughts that went into that publication and maybe just the larger kind of question that you brought up about academic approaches to Stanford and some of the challenges of publishing work to do what we all want to do, which is to heighten his exposure to make him more mainstream.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that's a gracious way to describe that book, I think.
I mean, even in shape, it's idiosyncratic. I mean, everything about it.
Well, I think, part of that is we just didn't know what the hell we were doing. I was 23 years old when we put that out, and so I've sort of grown up in publishing and in Stanford and all that. But I'm glad we did it that way. I think that the idea was that we didn't want to put out a folio of critical writing on Stanford because that seemed to be the conventional thing. We were, I think, more interested in his relevance to people who were writing poetry around us at that time. And so we wanted to combine that. So the book, for those of you who haven't read it, includes poetry that is in response to Stanford in some way that's contemporary. It also includes some historical pieces like a really beautiful prose reflection by Ginny Crouch Stanford, and then also some critical reflections as well, all together in the same thing. I think the intention was to throw light on just how big and interesting and diverse the readership around Stanford actually was, to kind of challenge this idea that it was niche or like exclusively masculine or whatever. And I think we did an all right job of that, but now that we're approaching nearly 10 years on from that publication, I've decided that we want to put out an expanded edition, because I think more people do need to be invited into the conversation, and the conversation has changed in the last 10 years. I'm thinking, I actually still to this day think of something you said, Canese, at the wonderful panel you put on in the gathering in Fayetteville in 2018. You remarked that there's a belief about the sense of the bodily in Stanford that it almost cannot be contained. It's exploding out of him. And that totally changed my thinking on all kinds of things in Stanford. I thought about the recurrence of the image of castration over and over. I thought about all of these portrayals of sexual encounters in childhood, all kinds of things, right? And I think of that often now because it's a reminder of the benefit that we get from different perspectives continuing to come into the conversation. I was just remarking before, so that's why, in this book we invited in Terrence Hayes, who I heard, through the grapevine cared a lot about Stanford, but hadn't actually written about Stanford. Ada Limon had a great poem about Stanford, but also, wasn't somebody who was writing critically about Stanford. I just noticed here, and remarked on this before the panel started, I reread Forrest Gander's 2008 note in the Battlefield, where he says in an offhand kind of way that Stephanie Burt helped rerun all of the text and look for errors. And I wasn't aware that Stephanie Burt had ever written anything about Stanford either. So there are more people alive and writing today who I think should now join the conversation, and hopefully creating a space like we're doing here today, or like additional, the expanded Constant Stranger we want to put out could make that happen.
We take for granted, by the way, that people in this room know who Frank Stanford was. We didn't really do much of an introduction to Frank Stanford, but if you have questions, we will have a Q&A to follow.
We will, yeah. So I think we can't, in researching Stanford's life, the theme of race is intimately connected with his life experience. This is a man who went to boarding school at Subiaco with a Confederate flag that he hung on the wall of his dorm room. And, 5-6 years later, he's spending most of his time in Fayetteville at a bar called Sherman's Tavern, which is a mostly black bar, and his friends are mostly black in Fayetteville. And this is reflected in the Battlefield. It's reflected in his poetry. He underwent I'd say a quite dramatic transition in his racial thinking, and there's, I think, a lot of factors that play into this transformation. For me, it's one of the most significant developments in his life, and it's something that I track throughout the biography. But I wanted to kind of open up the floor to see if there's any thoughts that you want to kind of develop or explore when it comes to Stanford and race. Bill, do you want to?
One thing that I'd like to address about that is that there was a fellow that was one of Frank's co-students, like at Subiaco, that wrote a little letter, a small book about Frank and his racism.
You're talking about Leo
Yes,
Lansing?
yes.
Yeah.
And I think maybe Frank was pulling the wool over all those guys' eyes, because in my experience with Frank, from the time that we were 12 and 13 years old until the time he died, Frank Stanford never had a racial thought or idea whatsoever. And that was from the beginning of our tenure, where we experienced racism, at the University of Arkansas, until the time that he died. Yeah. And all the people he associated with and the people that he knew.
Did you, in Mountain Home, was the situation, what was the situation in Mountain Home racially when you all lived there?
Well, there was no black people whatsoever, in Mountain Home, Arkansas. And the only black person was there at the time was they brought their maid with them, Frank, and Dorothy, and his father, brought them with them, but she didn't stay very long. And I don't know whether it was the attitude that people may have had against her, which probably it was. But Frank and Dorothy, neither one of those people were racist whatsoever. And the book was completely erroneous as far as I could. When I read it, I thought I was appalled, that it was even written. But I think he put on the front for those guys, just to satisfy them, and they probably laughed about it.
Other thoughts, Adam?
I think race is very complicated, as are most things in Stanford's life. He definitely had some challenges. When he grew up around levee camps. His adoptive father was a levee builder along the Mississippi River. Most employees of the levee camps were African American. He grew up around that African American dialect a lot in the summers. Went to school in grade school in Memphis, so he was around that culture, around a lot of African American culture even more. That was all complicated by the fact that he grew up in an adoptive family that was rather well-to-do. His father, they had a driver, drove a Cadillac, grew up around some intellectual offerings as well. There were books, there were people who could instruct him, and he was trying to blend these different backgrounds and different cultures. His mother had a certain politics that was somewhat different than what Stanford's politics became. It's almost difficult for me to articulate Stanford's approach to race in just in a minute. You almost need not just a long essay, but a book or volumes of books. But I do think he had I should also mention he was adopted. From the day he was born, he never learned who his adoptive parents were, and he has a slightly unusual complexion, such that he never really knew what his makeup was ethnically or racially. And I think he wondered if he maybe had, as the battlefield uses the language, if he was double exposed, if maybe he was possibly part black, part white.
He entertained this openly, didn't
yeah, he entertained it openly, and so it's all there, and it's in the work, and he felt a responsibility to depict all these people fairly, whether it was white Americans or African Americans or anyone. I do think he deeply loved humanity. I think he deeply loved human beings and humankind in a way that transcended a lot of the borders and boundaries that exist or sometimes that we've constructed. He believed in, basically, as he put it, not really even in an internationalism, more like a universality, basically.
Yeah, no, I think that's very well put, and I think it's just worth reminding ourselves that this is, capacity was the word that you used earlier. I mean, his, capacity for loving is really a good word. All kinds of people, misfits, outsiders, grotesques, as they're often called in Southern literature, was really remarkable. And I would add that one way to read the battlefield, there are many ways to read the battlefield, but to read it looking for examples of this sense of double exposure or sense of being mixed race is a really fascinating way to read that text. You can pass.
Pass if you want.
You covered just about everything I wanted to say.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that.
I'd like to add,
Yeah.
when Frank was a young person, he was continually, he had an appointment with psychiatrists all the time, like when he was a teenager, and also even when he was at the University of Arkansas. And I think that his exposure with those young black kids, the levee camps, and they gave him an intelligence test, when he was young, and his IQ was off the charts. Like an extremely important person, a smart person. But I think he was having troubles, with the idea that he was a Southern aristocrat, with relatives from the Earl of Sandwich of England, and then at the same time thinking that he may had actually, be part black or something else. Especially when he's hanging around all these young kids, and some of his features, suggested that, his curly hair, it never needed to be combed. The differentiation between his skin on his backside of his hand and his palm, and Frank was definitely not stupid. So he had something going on, and that was one of the reasons that he had to go to the psychiatrist all the time. Dorothy is trying to brainwash him at all times, saying, "You're a white boy, you're a white boy." Frank is probably in his mind, subconsciously and consciously saying, "There's something rotten in Denmark, and I want to find out what it is."
I just want to also briefly mention class. Like, he did grow up rich. He grew up sort of in this aristocratic,
Yes, he did.
with a family that had the kind of a Southern aristocratic mentality. But by 1968, he's broke.
Yes.
He lived in poverty essentially for the rest of his life, and so there's that transition to consider as well as we think about the complexity of his life. Adam, I want to give you a little more time before we open things up for questions to talk about the letters themselves, because again, we have the oral histories and as part of the Stanford archive, but these letters are critical and they do have a deeply poetic quality to them. And so I want you to talk a little bit about sort of the Herculean task of tracking those letters down, but then maybe comment a little bit about how they might help us understand Stanford's work.
Sure. Yeah, these letters that he wrote, there's a wealth of them. We haven't found them all yet. The book that we're doing, I call it like a mini book because it feels so small to me. I got to remind myself, it really isn't small. It's probably about 450 pages. It's about 160 letters, but this is well less than half the number of letters that have surfaced so far, and there's going to be a lot more. He expressed himself in letters. He was more comfortable, Stanford was, in connecting with many people on the page than he was almost in person. When he met one of his idols, well, he had already met him actually, Alan Dugan, but then they started corresponding. When he met Dugan again a couple years later, it was an awkward meeting, and this was sometimes the case where meeting someone whom he had corresponded with was an awkward experience. The letters are, to use the cliche, a window into the soul of a working artist through all of his turmoils and anxieties and stresses. That's all there, and you get a privileged glimpse into that soul of this mad, tortured, frankly, genius poet. And they're fascinating. I think for a lot of people, they maybe won't ever get to the letters. For them, they don't need them. They got the poetry, and that's that. But I think there's going to be some people out there that have difficulty understanding poetry because poetry is very difficult. It's difficult to understand and access poetry, and then instead they're going to connect with these letters in a way that they wanted to connect with this poet and never really got a chance to before. I had to annotate them to some degree because he'll just riff off into French and not tell you what he's quoting from, whether it's you might not even put it in quotes. It could be from André Breton or it could be from François Villon. And his handwriting is sometimes absolutely catastrophic. And good luck figuring out what any of this says. So there's been people at this table I've contacted before saying, do you have any idea what you think? What do you think this word is?
Spending half a day trying to figure it out.
There were times I spent weeks, months, or years coming back to letters and trying to figure out what this word was or that word was. So yeah.
Well, it's actually the range, the omnivorous nature of his curiosity was, as a biographer, very hard to keep up with, and the letters were very helpful in this respect, in that they sort of humanized a genius in some ways for me, and gave me a little confidence that at least I sort of understood the individual that I was writing about. But at times I felt like this man's brain is so far ahead of mine that I don't think I can do it.
The word is encyclopedic. He had encyclopedic range. Yeah.
All right, before I open things up for questions, are there any other ideas or thoughts or
I'd like to add, with Frank's writing, that there at Buchanan Street where I experienced the most, like Frank it was like he had a thorn in him that he had to get out, and he had to get it out as quick as he could. He was just prolifically writing, like it was just automatic. And the most unfortunate thing that he did was he used a fountain pen back in those days. Mm-hmm. And when you write on paper, fountain pens expand, and so it makes it hard to read and find out what those words really were. But if you think about it long enough, you can.
I'll end on a teaser. He might have also used blood. That's forthcoming.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we can open. I want to leave a little time to open things up to questions. Does anyone want to ask a question about what we've talked about? Yes.
This would be addressed to, let me get the name right,
Aidan.
Aidan
No,
Adam.
no, the person, you.
Canese.
Kitty.
Okay, sorry, wrong name. No, I thought what you had mentioned about the haircut, the dressing up haircut poem was real interesting. Because it sounded like a poem of baptism by the old men. And this reminded me of first haircuts of little boys, as much as the grown man dressing up to maybe meet another man in whatever context. And I thought that was very interesting because it sounded like the way women get dressed up for each other. And that it's not necessarily sexual, but and the baptism was, you look beautiful, this is the way you should look, and the old men line up. I just thought that was a really interesting poem.
Yeah.
And it's definitely very unusual for a man to write about men's beauty.
I think he had a deep reference, and I think Bill can speak to the fact that he was a very sharp dresser.
He won best dressed. I think it was 9th grade or 10th grade. He won best dressed.
But he, I think, it shows that he had a deep reverence for other men that he respected, and it shows in his writing. And I particularly love reading some of his letters to the Benedictine monks at Subiaco, where he went to school for a while. And they're so funny and tender and unexpected, and it really in thinking about that, the way that sort of baptism, I guess, or the reference for touch, it seems apparent, and I think it's really tremendously beautiful, and it's unexpected, especially when I think on the surface, people do kind of associate him with this hyper masculine spirit, but I don't think that's true at all.
I might add to that. When Frank was at Subiaco, he entered a poem in 17 magazine, and it won a prize. And the people from 17 magazine came down to Paris, Arkansas, trying to find Francis Stanford.
Francis Gilder.
Francis Gilder.
Yeah.
Francis Gilder.
That was in 72, though, wasn't it?
72 and 3.
Yeah, so it's a little later than that, but you're right. He snuck up, because he needed the money, I think, and he snuck a poem into 17 and got paid a fair amount of money for it. And
15
he posted
years old.
a 15-year-old girl, yeah.
Apparently, a 15-year-old girl named Francis Gilder. So talented.
I first read Read It Dog in 17 magazine. It was like in college. Yeah.
I want to say something. Both in the context of Stanford and race, and in the context of academia. When I went back to grad school late in life, I had a linguistics class, and I wrote on battlefield. And there's a beautiful passage in it where the white narrator, which one would assume is him, speaking to a black friend, and he's kind of asking him how to be accepted in the African American community. And what he says is, how do I want to be able to say the N-word the way you say the N-word. Mm-hmm. Okay, and it's almost like his relationship to race and his relationship to gender are very similar. That he kind of wanted, he really, kind of wanted to be black in a way, and wanted to be able to move in both worlds at least.
Bill is referring to a scene in the battlefield in which 12-year-old, the poet hero Francis Gilder has a conversation with Charlie B. Lemon, who was actually the real life character's name, who was the family driver. And yeah, he says, "Can I say the N word the way you say it?" And Charlie B. says, "Sure, you absolutely can." So he says it once, and then he points to another person, and he says, "That's another one over there, isn't it?" And Charlie B. says, "Yes, it sure is." And after about the third time or the fourth time, Charlie B. says, "That's enough for one day."
Yeah, he was getting a little too excited. Saying, great. The monks, we haven't really talked much about the monks and the influence
we haven't mentioned Subiaco.
of the monks or Subiaco. Are there questions that we could talk about that unless there are other questions? Well, I think this is also like intricately tied up with masculinity as well, because he deeply admired those monks for a number of qualities. He was never religious himself, but he absolutely admired the way that the monks lived their life, and a lot of those qualities were pretty masculine. Self-sufficiency, killing their own animals, growing their own food, and this kind of it's almost a kind of survivalist quality that they had.
They ran a rock quarry. They ran a rock quarry.
They had a rock quarry as well. Yeah. So, any further thoughts on
Subiaco?
Yeah.
Subiaco was a formative influence. Subiaco is a monastery, a Benedictine monastery and preparatory school in central Arkansas, and south of Fort Smith a bit. And this is where he went to preparatory school, the junior and senior years of high school. And it was I think he had gotten a lot of background education until then. It seems to be that from his peers, many of whom went on to have great careers, they looked up to Frank as being the most literary person among them, even at that age, which would have been 16, 17, 18. The poet laureate of Subiaco, yeah. But that said, it is also widely established that Subiaco was a formative influence on him. It would have been a rigorous education, introduced to a lot of classics, and he was maybe introduced to Thomas Merton there, I'm not sure, but many saints and thinkers and intellectuals within the long history of the Catholic tradition helped to shape him then. Yeah.
Yes.
I heard about Frank Stanford from different kinds of poets, like 30 years ago, 25 years ago, up in Boston, and it was the people who loved Dugan, and it was people who were. I went to a Southern program. There were Southern poets who didn't like mainstream Southern poetry.
Yeah.
And a lot of people just with a kind of a general feeling that they didn't like the way contemporary poetry was going, and that Frank Stanford was weird.
Yeah.
And spooky and unconscious, more connected to the unconscious, and yet doing narrative with a totally different kind of energy. I was wondering, what was it like? What was the Arkansas program like that he came out of? Like, what kind of was that, like a formalist program or what?
Good. It's a great question.
Let Ralph answer.
Oh, Ralph. Yeah, no. Actually, Ralph was much better qualified to answer this question than the other person who knew Frank Stanford. Yeah.
It was the professors who were formalists, almost in some universities were. Frank was only in the workshop for one semester or two.
It was a couple semesters, yeah. Try to speak up a little bit, Ralph. Thanks.
He was only in the workshop 69, 70, and never again. And you made friends with some of the people in the workshop, but you also stay away from almost everybody. Until about 75, 76, when we started Foundlings Press, and then you became more connected to people that you hadn't been friends with.
Yeah, I mean, it was not a tight fit by any stretch of the imagination. Yeah, and he, in the years after he left the program or took those classes, he had some pretty unpleasant things to say about some of the people and some of the experiences that he had in that program. Almost burning bridges. We have one.
In one poem he says,
Is it flies on shit?
No. It was, I suffered fools gladly.
Okay.
I suffered the fools gladly.
Yeah, and it was.
Several of the poets there pretty much thought he was talking about that.
Yeah, and it was sort of ungenerous simply because a lot of the poets there really supported him and really helped him. So it's
the thing about that program is that it was the most contentious group of poets I've ever been in. I mean, there were like neo-formalists all the way to like surrealist, budding language poets, okay? And it was like a divide that was pretty brutal. I mean, these workshops were, there was no holding back. I can remember one neo-formalist poet wrote a poem that it had a line in its refrain, "There are still things that have no name," and the last line was, "There are still things sweet that have no name." And they started talking about, can we replace that name sweet with something? Somebody else said, yeah, how about stupid? that was the way those workshops went. And I mean, like, you know, formalists on one side, surrealists on another. And they all but broke into fights sometimes.
Yeah, there's Jim Clark, the late editor of the Greensboro Review, did say to me that Arkansas was a good place to go if you're really good at arm wrestling.
Well, I would have loved to have had that before I finished my book. That would be.
I was the second smallest guy in the workshop, and most of them had been football players. My basic family is there really were arm wrestling contests. I was out early, but.
All right, well, before we go, I want to thank Aidan, who came from Buffalo, Canese came from Kansas City, Adam came from New Hampshire, and Bill Willett from Mountain Home, Arkansas. Thank you all so much, and thanks for